It's day 45 and Nancy Guthrie is still missing. But something just broke open this case that complicates the official story we've been told. A neighbor of Nancy just stepped forward with a confirmation about Nancy's front door that changes the entire framework of how this abduction could have happened. And if what she's describing is accurate, it means who took Nancy away was no stranger. Nancy's front door had no forced entry. It was opened from the inside, and that single fact is the reason this case on day 45 still does not have an arrest. Despite a full-scale national coverage, hundreds of investigators, $1 million reward, and billboard campaigns stretching across 6 states, not one person, not a reporter, not a commentator, not a local analyst, stopped long enough to ask what should have been one of the most basic questions in this entire case. What exactly was Nancy Guthrie's front door? Not the camera mounted on it, not the footage recovered from it. The actual physical door. On March 16th, News Nation correspondent Brian Enton sat down with a neighbor named Laura, someone who lives in the same Catalina foothills community, the same high desert neighborhood where Nancy Guthrie has built her life over decades. And Laura describes something that reframes every working assumption investigators and the media have been operating from since day one. Nancy Guthrie's front entrance was not a single door. It was 2 separate barriers stacked in sequence, a solid oak door set behind an outer wrought iron security gate, 2 locks, 2 different materials, 2 different directions of swing. And when both of those barriers are locked, Laura's words were plain. They are really, really difficult to get through.
Morning, and I saw him out there. So I couldn't make out his face. He was in kind of street clothes, not shoes that you'd walk in, and he had a baseball hat really low, and he was kind of hunched over.
She knows exactly what it takes to move through those barriers. And what she is describing structurally and mechanically is a front entrance that an armed stranger could not defeat in the dark at 2 in the morning without making noise, without leaving evidence of damage, and without help from someone who was already inside. So the question we will try to answer in this video is simple. If that gate cannot be broken, and if 6 weeks of investigation have produced no public account of smashed locks, cut hinges, or structural damage to that entrance, then how did Nancy Guthrie leave her own home? The evidence is pointing toward one answer, and it is the most uncomfortable one available. The gate was already open because somebody cleared that path before the man on the porch ever arrived. To begin, let's return to February 4th. Day 4 after Nancy's disappearance. The Associated Press published a report citing a person described as familiar with the investigation who told them that investigators had found signs of forced entry at Nancy Guthrie's home. That same source indicated investigators also found specific evidence inside the residence confirming a nighttime kidnapping had taken place. CNN picked it up. The Hill cited it. Multiple major national outlets published the AP's reporting. Then came the sheriff's press conference the very next day, February 5th. A reporter asked Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos directly about the forced entry report. His response was not a denial. He did not call the AP wrong. He did not issue a correction or describe the report as misinformation. What he said was,
Miss Guthrie, Nancy Guthrie, is of great sound mind. This is not a dementia related. She is as sharp as a tack. The family wants everybody to know.
The Associated Press does not fabricate law enforcement quotes in nationally covered active missing persons cases. A source inside this investigation spoke to them on the record, anonymously, but on the record. And the sheriff's chosen response was not to deny what that source said, but to refuse to discuss the subject entirely. There is a significant difference between those two things. So here is the problem those two pieces of evidence create when placed against each other. The AP's law enforcement source says there were signs of forced entry. A neighbor who has the identical security setup says that wrought iron gate cannot be broken. If forced entry occurred, what exactly was forced? If the gate was not defeated, and the neighbor's account strongly suggests it cannot be defeated, then what did investigators find that a law enforcement source described as signs of forced entry? A window? A back door? A garage access point? And why has none of that specificity appeared in public reporting across 45 days of intense media coverage? Or the third possibility, which the physical evidence of this case increasingly supports, the term forced entry is being used. broadly to describe evidence that someone entered the home against Nancy's will, not specifically evidence that the front gate was destroyed, in which case the front gate was not the point of entry. Something or someone else was. Retired FBI Special Agent Maureen O'Connell appeared on Brian Enton's program and walked through the physical mechanics of how she believes Nancy was taken out of that home. Her reconstruction is one of the most specific analytical accounts to emerge from any law enforcement expert in this case, and it is worth examining carefully. O'Connell described what she believes happened at the front entrance. The abductors, she said, had to back up to open the large oak door. Then they had to open the wrought iron gate. And all of this was happening while they were trying to control or carry an 84-year-old woman who, per every medical characterization in this investigation, has limited mobility and depends on daily medication. The word carry is O'Connell's own. She said Nancy was likely carried out of her home, which means she was either unconscious or so physically incapacitated that she could not support her own weight. Picture what that operation actually looks like in the dark, at 2 a.m, at the front door of a private residence in a quiet desert neighborhood. At least 2 people are required. Retired federal agents across the board have been consistent on that point. One or more of them is managing Nancy's body weight. One of them has a weapon in a front holster, gloves on both hands, and a flashlight in his mouth, as the FBI's own doorbell footage shows, both hands occupied. And yet 2 separate doors, each requiring someone with a free hand to manipulate, somehow got opened. The only scenario where that operation works without someone getting tangled, dropping something, making noise loud enough to wake a neighbor, or leaving physical damage to the barriers is a scenario where those barriers were already open, where somebody had already pulled the gate back and held the oak door wide before the man on the porch was ever called to approach. Neighbor Laura is explicit about what she believes. She said she does not think the man captured in the doorbell footage was making any attempt to breach the front entrance. She believes he was waiting.
Really low, and he was kind of hunched over, and he was kind of looking around, and he just didn't fit. And he wasn't going terribly quickly like a normal person that's getting exercise. He was kind of going slowly, and when he walked by this street, he really took a long look at it.
That is a neighbor who knows those doors, knows the neighborhood, and has watched this case for 6 weeks, drawing a conclusion from what she observes about the physical setup. Nancy Guthrie's blood was found on her front porch. That fact has been confirmed by Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, who described the quantity as minimal. Subsequent reporting described what appeared to be drops trailing in the direction of the driveway. Not a pooled wound, but movement, someone bleeding while being carried or guided outward from the home toward the street. The location of that blood is the detail that keeps getting underweighted in media coverage, and it should not be. If a stranger forced his way into this home, overpowered the front entrance, pushed through into the living space, found Nancy in her bedroom or hallway, and seized her, the first blood would land inside. That is where the confrontation begins. That is where the physical contact happens before she is moved. The blood would trace inward first, then outward. But the blood is on the porch, outside, past both barriers, in drops that move toward the driveway, not back toward the rooms where Nancy slept. O'Connell offered one reconstruction, the abductors navigating those 2 heavy doors while carrying Nancy. The awkward physical negotiation of backing up and maneuvering through narrow opening frames, and in that process, at the threshold between inside and outside, her head turned or dropped, and that is when the blood fell. That reading makes sense if someone was already holding the doors open and the injury happened at the point of exit. Another possibility is that Nancy was brought to the door while still conscious, or made her way there herself, responding to a sound, a voice, something familiar enough to draw her out of bed and toward the entrance without triggering alarm. She opens the door, she opens the gate, she steps onto the porch expecting something she recognized, and finds herself outside with no capacity to retreat. No phone, no one who will hear her, and whatever is waiting at the bottom of those steps. Either way, the blood on the porch tells the same story. Nancy was already outside her home when something happened to her, and in both reconstructions, those doors were opened from the inside. When Jennifer Coffin Daffer, a retired FBI special agent and former SWAT team member, analyzed the doorbell footage released by the FBI on February 10th, she identified something in the suspect's jacket pocket, an antenna, the kind attached to a handheld walkie-talkie. Her public assessment was direct and unambiguous. The man on the porch definitely had an accomplice and maybe more than one. She wrote, "No way you commit this abduction by yourself. See the antenna? See the handheld walkie-talkie? They were coordinated." Coordinated is the operative word. A walkie-talkie is a deliberate operational choice. It does not generate a cell record. It does not ping a tower. It does not produce location data. Whoever this man was communicating with in real time at 2 in the morning did not want that exchange traced to a phone number. And the very fact that he needed real-time communication at all confirms the existence of at least one other person, someone in another position, sending and receiving at that precise moment, whose role in the operation required synchronization with what was happening at the front door. Retired FBI supervisory agent Lance Leasing, analyzing the same footage for CBS Evening News, described the suspect as someone who has taken great planning to hide their appearance, yet poor planning and poor professionalism as to how they approached this door and the ultimate crime scene. That combination is revealing. The preparation, the mask, the gloves, the walkie-talkie, the specific backpack, the weapon, reflects deliberate planning done well in advance. The execution at the door reflects someone waiting on a signal rather than someone who had just overpowered an entrance by himself. The body language in the footage, the downward tilt of the head as he moves through the archway, the hesitation at the camera, this is a man who is waiting for a green light, not one who has just forced his way through anything. To understand why the insider theory carries the weight it does, the timeline of that night has to be walked through carefully and completely. Nancy Guthrie arrives home at approximately 9:48 p.m. Her garage door closes at 9:50 p.m. By the sheriff's own characterization, that is the moment investigators assume she went inside and headed to bed. What follows is 3 hours and 57 minutes of silence. At 1:47 in the morning, her doorbell camera is disconnected. This is not a technical glitch or a power fluctuation specific to one device. The camera was disconnected, physically interfered with. At 2:12 a.m., a separate surveillance camera's software detects movement near the front of the house. Investigators have been careful to note the system could have registered an animal, not necessarily a person. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker monitoring app disconnects from her phone. Her phone, which was left behind inside the house. At that moment, she was far enough away from her own device that the Bluetooth connection between the pacemaker monitor and the phone severed. She was outside. She was being moved, and the world would not know she was gone for another 9 hours. Now layer onto that timeline what was happening in the surrounding neighborhood. A neighbor reported to investigators that their Ring camera had no footage from the night Nancy disappeared. The history was simply not available, with no clear technical explanation. The FBI confirmed it is investigating whether a Wi-Fi jammer or other form of signal disruption was deployed that night. Sheriff Nanos, in his March 12th interview with NBC News, confirmed investigators are looking into why things in the neighborhood went offline during that window, and that they checked with power companies and neighbors for an explanation. He also noted a damaged utility box near Nancy's home was examined, though investigators do not currently believe it is connected. A Wi-Fi jammer is not improvised. It requires advanced acquisition and deliberate deployment at a specific time and a specific location. If one was used that night, someone calculated which neighborhood cameras would be affected and timed the disruption to the window they needed. That level of electronic coordination does not come from someone who found Nancy's address the week before. The reconnaissance timeline deepens that picture significantly. When Laura spoke to Brian Enton on March 16th, she disclosed that investigators had asked her for security camera footage from two specific dates, January 11th and January 24th. Both dates fall weeks before Nancy's disappearance. Investigators do not request footage from specific prior dates because something vaguely interesting caught their attention. They request it because they believe a specific person was in that area on those specific days, and they want to know who that person was and what they were doing. A separate neighbor, Aldine Meister, who has lived in the Catalina foothills for nearly 30 years, reported seeing a man in the neighborhood approximately 3 weeks before Nancy vanished. He didn't belong, she said, not in any explicit way she could immediately name, but in the way a longtime resident reads someone who doesn't fit the organic patterns of a place. He was in street clothes, not hiking or exercise gear, which is what people in that walkable desert community wear when they're out on foot. He was moving slowly, and when he reached a particular street, she said he took a long, deliberate look at it. She mentioned it to her husband and her mother at the time, then said nothing publicly. She has since reported the sighting to law enforcement 3 weeks before the abduction, walking slowly, studying the street, January 11th and January 24th, flagged by investigators as dates of interest. The picture that assembles from those pieces is of a crime that was being planned, actively, specifically, by someone who had already identified the target and was studying the terrain. Inside Nancy's home, investigators found DNA that does not belong to her, does not belong to anyone in her immediate family, does not match her landscaper, and does not match her housekeeper. Sheriff Nanos confirmed that the department collected DNA from Nancy, from family members, and from the people in regular contact with her home. And the unknown profile that remains in the sample after all those eliminations belongs to none of them. That matters more than its media coverage has reflected. There are innocent explanations for the presence of unknown DNA inside any private home. A repair technician, a one-time visitor, someone who was inside months ago for reasons completely unrelated to the crime. Investigators are aware of that and are working through those possibilities. But every person with a routine, documented reason to be inside that house has already been tested and eliminated. What remains is a biological profile from someone who has not been accounted for. Someone whose presence inside Nancy Guthrie's home has no established explanation. Brian Entin, who has spent more than 6 weeks reporting from Tucson, has stated publicly that he believes the DNA found inside the house will prove to be the most important piece of evidence in this entire investigation. His reasoning is direct. It is a stranger's genetic material inside a private residence, not on a glove recovered 2 miles down a desert road, which investigators traced to a restaurant employee with no connection to the case, but inside the home itself, inside the rooms where Nancy lived, slept, and spent her private time. Nanos confirmed on March 12th that he remains hopeful that DNA evidence will ultimately lead to a match. The department has indicated it is pursuing investigative genetic genealogy, the same forensic technique used to identify the Golden State Killer decades after his crimes by tracing unknown DNA through publicly available ancestry databases. The mixed nature of the sample has complicated that process because mixed profiles, biological material from multiple contributors, are significantly harder to parse and attribute than a single clean profile. Nanos has said the mixture may contain contributions from several individuals, but the process has not been abandoned, and every new felony arrest that feeds into the national CODIS database is another potential match point against whatever profile investigators have extracted from that sample. The public conversation around Tommaso Cioni has to be addressed honestly, because ignoring it would be a disservice to anyone trying to understand how this investigation has unfolded. On February 3rd, journalist Ashley Banfield, citing what she described as a law enforcement source with, in her words, impeccable credentials and direct knowledge of the investigation, reported on her Drop Dead Serious podcast that Cioni, Nancy's son-in-law, husband of her daughter Annie, the man who drove Nancy home the night she disappeared, may be a prime suspect. The Pima County Sheriff's Department responded quickly, with Nanos calling the report reckless at his February 5th press conference. He said the department did not have anyone listed as a suspect. On February 16th, Nanos issued a formal written statement. To be clear, the Guthrie family, to include all siblings and spouses, has been cleared as possible suspects in this case. The family has been nothing but cooperative and gracious and are victims in this case. That clearance is official and it stands. Savannah Guthrie has reportedly been described by Megyn Kelly on her Sirius XM show as livid about the reporting that targeted her brother-in-law, and that reaction is understandable given what the family is already enduring. And yet Banfield has not walked any of it back. On February 12th, in a Sirius XM appearance with Dan Abrams, she said her source stands by the information. On March 13th, on her own podcast, she raised a challenge directly at Sheriff Nanos that has not been adequately answered in public. Why did my source tell me what your focus was on day one? You towed the brother-in-law's car, then you searched their house, and you called off the search for Nancy Guthrie. You turned over the scene, and you told the public there was nothing to worry about. What changed, Sheriff Nanos? Those questions are not personal attacks on the Guthrie family. They are questions about the investigative sequencing in the first 72 hours of this case. If investigators had a working theory about motive from day one, which Nanos has since confirmed, then the decisions made in that opening window deserve scrutiny. Why was the active physical search for Nancy wound down as quickly as it was? Why was the crime scene released and then re-entered? And when the sheriff says he has known the likely motive since day one, what exactly did he see in those first hours that gave investigators that level of early confidence? The facts around Sione are what they are. He is approximately 50 years old, Italian-born. He has worked as a biology teacher, and he is also a poet. A creative life he shares with Annie, who has spoken about their relationship with evident warmth. On the night of January 31st, he drove Nancy home from dinner. Sheriff Nanos confirmed to the New York Times that Sione ensured she made it inside safely before leaving. The garage door opened at 9:48 p.m. and closed at 9:50 p.m., and by the sheriff's account, that is when Nancy went to bed. What happened in Sione's evening after that point is not a matter of public record. Where he went after dropping Nancy off, what time he arrived back at his own home, whether any account of his movements in the hours between 9:50 p.m. and sunrise exists. None of that has been presented in any official briefing. Investigators spoke with him, as they did with everyone who had contact with Nancy. The car he and Annie shared, a blue Honda CR-V, was impounded and as of March 11th remained in law enforcement custody, reportedly being put back together at an auto mechanic shop following an exhaustive forensic examination. Law enforcement was also observed at the Sione/Guthrie home on February 7th, with CNN and Fox News both reporting agents present at the property. All of this is consistent with standard investigative procedure when the last known contact with a missing person involves specific individuals and a specific vehicle, and the family has been formally and officially cleared. Both of those things are true at the same time, and in a case this complicated, that kind of layered truth matters. There's a serious counter-argument to the insider theory, and it deserves fair treatment. Multiple investigators and analysts have maintained that this could still be the work of someone with no direct personal relationship to Nancy, an external actor who conducted surveillance over time, studied the family's prominence through public information, and assembled enough knowledge to appear to have inside access without actually having it. Retired homicide detective Phil Ramos, speaking to Parade after Nanos' March 12th comments, made this point carefully. When the sheriff described the abduction as targeted, Ramos said that word implies the suspect had some degree of connection to Nancy, but connection does not require closeness. It can mean knowledge gathered entirely through observation and research. A patient outsider with enough time in that neighborhood could learn where the cameras sat, when Nancy came and went, and which access points were weakest, not through someone tipping him off, but through sustained, deliberate watching. The reconnaissance timeline supports this reading too. If someone was walking those streets on January 11th and again on January 24th, that kind of preparation could give an outsider everything he needed to understand the layout without ever crossing the threshold. Former FBI agent Johnny Grusing, who spent 25 years in the FBI's Denver division investigating violent crimes, offered another reading through Fox News. He proposed that the suspect may have had a personal grievance against Nancy herself, not targeting the Guthrie family's wealth, not targeting Savannah's profile, but holding something specific against an 84-year-old woman. He suggested the possibility that Nancy was lured out of her home onto the porch, drawn to the door by something or someone she recognized or trusted, and that the blood on the porch is evidence not of being dragged through a forced entry, but of being outside her own home voluntarily when the situation turned. She opened the door, she opened the gate, she stepped out, and the violence happened in the open air before she could retreat. Both theories, inside accomplice and deliberate deception from outside, share one structural element that cannot be explained away. This crime required specific knowledge of Nancy Guthrie as an individual, her home, Her schedule, her mobility limitations, her camera setup, her neighborhood's digital infrastructure. Whoever executed this did not pick a house at random in the dark. They picked her. And at day 45, with no arrest and a $1.2 million reward sitting unclaimed, the question of how they came to know what they knew remains one of the central, unresolved mysteries of this case. When Nanos spoke to NBC nightly news correspondent Liz Kreutz on March 12th, he confirmed two things publicly that have not gotten the attention they deserve together. First, that investigators believe the abduction was targeted. We believe we know why he did this, and we believe that it was targeted. Second, that the suspect could strike again. Don't think for a minute that because it happened to the Guthrie family, you're safe. Keep your wits about you. A sheriff warning the public that a kidnapper may strike again is not a routine statement. It is a sheriff describing an active threat to the broader community from someone who, on day 45, remains unidentified and unapprehended. Retired FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer told Newsweek that she believes the motive Nanos is describing is ransom, a financially motivated crime targeting the family of one of America's most visible broadcast journalists, planned around the assumption that the Guthrie name carries financial resources. The ransom notes sent to media outlets, the Bitcoin demands, the deadlines that came and passed, all of it is consistent with that framing. But Banfield raised a challenge on her March 13th podcast that sits uncomfortably against that timeline. If the sheriff's investigators had a theory about the motive from day one, and that theory pointed toward a financially motivated, targeted abduction, then the early decision to call off the physical search and process the scene as a contained crime rather than an active rescue operation carries weight. When Banfield asked what changed, Sheriff Nanos, that question was not about Tommaso Cioni specifically. It was about the choices made in those first critical hours when Nancy Guthrie could still have been alive and within reach. On day 45, nobody knows with certainty whether she still is. Retired FBI agent Steve Moore gave the most precise explanation of why a $1.2 million combined reward has generated no credible leads from someone coming forward. I think the reason is most likely the fact that the only people who have knowledge of this are culpable. That is the portrait of a sealed, tight operational circle, not a crime with peripheral witnesses, neighbors who saw a suspicious car, delivery drivers who noticed something unusual, friends of an accomplice who heard something and stayed quiet. A crime where the people who know are the people who did it, where there is no innocent bystander with enough knowledge to collect $1 million and walk away clean because no innocent bystander got close enough to know anything. That kind of silence does not happen by accident. It is structural. It is the result of a plan that kept its exposure contained, whether through trust, through fear, or through the simple mathematics of a very small number of people involved. And small circle operations with functional communication, like a walkie-talkie signal between someone inside and someone waiting on a porch, are either the work of professionals or of people with enough personal familiarity with the target that they did not need to recruit broadly. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 45 days. The investigation is active. The unknown DNA inside the house has not been matched. The surveillance footage from January 11th and January 24th is still being analyzed. The wrought iron gate is still standing, its hinges intact, with no public account of how it was opened. The blood on the porch is still the only physical trace of where the violence began. And the $1.2 million is still waiting. The title of this video is not an accusation. It is the question the evidence forces onto the table, because no other framing fits all the facts simultaneously. Because if that gate, the one that a neighbor with the same setup says can never be broken, the one a retired FBI special agent had to reconstruct in forensic detail because of how difficult it is to move through while carrying a person, was not broken, and Nancy Guthrie still left through it in the middle of the night, then the answer to how this happened is not outside that door. It started inside. If you are watching this and you know something, anything, about what happened to Nancy Guthrie, you can contact the FBI directly at 1-800-CALL-FBI, submit a tip at tips.fbi.gov, or call the Pima County Sheriff's Department at 520-35-14900. There is $1.2 million waiting for information that helps bring her home. And if this video gave you something to think about, if it connected dots that The mainstream coverage has been leaving disconnected, then share it with someone who is following this case. Subscribe to this channel if you are not already here, because this series is not finished. This case is not finished, and we will keep digging until it is. Bring her home.